My name is Eric Gaskell, and you're listening to the Distorted History Podcast.
To speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
I can give you merry tales and joyous laughter.
Shameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
A long struggle for freedom.
It really is a revolution.
One of the most awful tragedies of modern times has visited Galveston. The city is in ruins, and the dead will number possibly 6,000. The wreck of Galveston was brought about by a tempest so terrible that no words can adequately describe its intensity, and by a flood which turned the city into a raging sea.
These were some of the first words the wider world would receive following the events of the 8th of September 1900. All lines of communication into and out of the island city of Galveston, Texas had been cut off that day, and this was one of the first accounts to be transmitted by telegraph in the wake of the disaster. The scope of such a calamity was hard to imagine. Sure, like I mentioned, the city's telegraph lines had been down, but such devastation as detailed in this missive was hard to believe, especially since the National Weather Bureau had predicted no such storm, or at least not one anywhere near such magnitude. Yet this telegram was all too true. In fact, the real death toll would actually be greater than even this alarming estimate, as it is now believed that somewhere around 8,000 people died to this singular event, making it the deadliest storm in American history. And to be clear, it isn't just the deadliest storm, but the deadliest natural disaster period, as the 1900 Galveston Hurricane's death toll exceeds even that of the San Francisco earthquake that would strike just 3 years after this, a disaster which I have detailed in another series. Yet before I go into greater detail about how such an overwhelming calamity and loss of life happened, first, like always, I want to give credit to my sources for this series, which include Eric Larson's Isaac Storm, A Man, a Time, and the Deadliest Hurricane in History, Nathan C. Green's Story of the 1900 Galveston Hurricane, John Edward Weems' A Weekend in September, Casey Edward Green and Shelley Henley Kelly's Through a Night of Horrors, Voices from the 1900 Galveston Storm, and Carrie A. Emanuel's Divine Wind, The History and Science of Hurricanes. And like always, these and any additional resources that I use, like websites and the American Experience episode American 1900, will be posted on this podcast Twitter page and Ko-fi page, links to which are in the description. And with all that being said, let's begin. Galveston, Texas is the second oldest continuously operating U.S. port in the Gulf of Mexico, behind only New Orleans. Galveston, you see, had been founded on a long, narrow island on the southern end of Galveston Bay in 1825, at a time when Texas was still a part of Mexico. Then, by the time the year 1900 rolled around, Galveston had become Texas's busiest seaport, a rise that was primarily the result of cotton that arrived in the city by train to be shipped out. The thing was, their primacy as Texas's great port city was not uncontested. Galveston, you see, had competition, as just a little ways inland sat Houston, whose residents and officials very much wanted their home to become a great city. So, Galveston was in a kind of race with Houston, but with that being said, the island city very much had a leg up on their competition at this point. You see, come 1880, Galveston had already become the largest city in Texas, and it wasn't like they had peaked then either, as the city could also boast of a population growth of about 3% annually. In fact, according to the 1900 census, in the previous 10-year span, Galveston had grown by 30%. It wasn't just Galveston's size either that made them appear to be shoo-ins to become America's next great city. Galveston wasn't some old city stuck in the past and living off its past glories. Instead, it was actively modernizing, as it would be the first city in Texas to use electric lighting, to have the first telephone switchboard in the state, and would host Texas's first official baseball game. Galveston then had electric lights, electric streetcars or trolleys, not one but two telegraph companies, and telephone service both local and long distance. It was also an attractive destination for visitors, as it also boasted 3 big concert halls and 20 hotels. Indeed, later author of military history John W. Thomason Jr. would visit the city as a child during the summer of 1900 and describe it as having, quote,
one of the most beautiful beaches in the world that offered delightful sunbathing, and you saw everybody there in the afternoon, bathing, promenading, or driving in carriages on the smooth, crisp sands.
In addition to these natural attractions, there were also the city's 500 saloons, which actually outnumbered those in New Orleans. Meanwhile, Galveston's downtown streets were paved with wooden blocks that had been hammered into the ground, and its Avenue B, which was known by locals as the Strand, had the reputation of being the Wall Street of the West. Galveston then was a modern city that was both a destination location and a place of business. Plus, their competition Houston was hampered by the fact that their waterway was shallow, a fact that made Galveston the preferable port. By 1900, in fact, Galveston had already become the third busiest port in the nation and the biggest cotton port, period. Competition or not, Galveston in 1900 then seemed poised to become the United States' next great port city, joining the likes of New Orleans, San Francisco, and Baltimore. The New York Herald had even proclaimed that Galveston was the New York of the Gulf. In fact, Galveston had by this point become one of the favored locations for new immigrants to arrive at. The city was popular because immigrants, upon arriving, could easily take the rail lines to the nation's undeveloped prairie lands in the hopes of carving out a new life for themselves. This influx of immigrants passing through and some deciding to stay would earn Galveston the nickname of the Western Ellis Island. The island city also had consulates from 16 countries, while its ports, in addition to being used to ship cotton, was also a departure point for luxury steamships like those of the famous White Star Line that took travelers from Galveston to Europe and vice versa. Not only that, but this Texas city was surprisingly progressive and inclusive, especially by the standards of the day, as there was said to have been a general level of tolerance as a mixture of whites, immigrants, Jewish people, and African Americans all coexisted in the city. In particular, thanks to the Negro Longshoremen's Association, who controlled the supply of labor on the city's wharfs, Galveston's black population had a standard of living higher than pretty much anywhere else in the U.S. Then there was the city's German immigrants, who made up about a third of Galveston's population. They were in fact the ones responsible for putting up the money for the city's garden club that consisted of a large octagonal dance hall in the center of a park that featured both tennis courts and a small zoo. This garden club was notably a place where women could come to dance, although the same women while there were not allowed to smoke or wear lipstick or rouge. Galveston was also full of grand ornate mansions, as reportedly the city was the home to more millionaires per square mile than Newport, Rhode Island, which was, during the Gilded Age, the home of the likes of the Astors and the Vanderbilts, who built fabulous mansions for their summer visits. These so-called cottages, as they were known in Newport, had more in common with European palaces and could contain 100 rooms. Yet as popular among the uber-rich as Newport, Rhode Island was, Galveston was apparently giving them a run for their money, as in 1899 the city was said to be the third richest in the U.S. in proportion to population. A number of these aforementioned millionaires then were likely members of Galveston's Artillery Club, which was a posh men's club that women weren't allowed into except for special events like their annual ball. Notably, this rich man's club was conveniently located right next to the city's fanciest whorehouse, although the vast majority of the city's dens of ill repute were located on a block known as Fat Alley, where alcohol, women, and opium were all available for a price and where opportunities to gamble were around every seedy corner. Now, the 1900 hurricane was not the first disaster the city had known. In fact, a great fire that struck the city in 1885 had left a mark on its future. You see, this fire had started when a furnace in the Vulcan Ironworks foundry overheated in the middle of the night on the 13th of November. The high winds blowing in from the north that night then ensured that the fire spread quickly to the south and to the west, and by the time all was said and done, essentially every wood frame residence for 40 square blocks was destroyed. Notably, though, one of the few buildings in that section of the city that remained standing was a city jail that had been saved due to its slate roof, which had not caught fire. Subsequently, following that disaster, all buildings in the city were required to have slate shingles instead of wood ones to prevent a repeat of that disaster. These slate roofs, however, would provide no protection for the next disaster to be visited upon Galveston, as fire was not what they had to worry about in September 1900. Instead, as we will see, water would be their greatest threat, seeing as how the city barely sat above sea level. In fact, the highest point on the island sat only 8.7 feet above sea level, and the average altitude in the city was roughly half of that. No one was worried about such things at the time, though. Sure, they had the occasional flood, but many of the houses on the island had been raised up above the highest watermark, and they thought themselves prepared. Galveston then was thriving and prosperous, as was seemingly much of the United States at the turn of the century. You see, the year 1900 was at the tail end of the Gilded Age, and America by that point could claim to have both the largest agricultural and largest industrial economy in the world. There were, according to the recently completed census, some 76 million people living in America at this moment. This was a time of transition for the country, as there were still more blacksmiths than doctors. The country on the whole, though, very much seemed to be on the upswing, with the obvious caveats that this prosperity did not apply to everyone. There was, after all, a reason why you see the rise of labor unions and many major labor disputes around this time. Plus, even more obviously, American culture at this time was intensely racist, as African Americans were routinely portrayed in popular media as ignorant racist caricatures. Then there was also the reality that after Reconstruction had been abandoned by Northerners and their politicians, Jim Crow now reigned supreme in the South, which meant the passing of numerous racist laws designed to strip African Americans of their rights and freedoms. It wasn't just legal oppression either, as extra-legal terror was also popular, as there were a reported 107 lynchings in 1899, and the fact that this number is reported suggests that there were likely many more that did not make it into the official records. Yet, despite this obvious issue, an anti-lynching bill introduced by the last remaining black congressman went absolutely nowhere, largely because it had been introduced by a black congressman and because it was concerned with preserving the lives of African Americans. That being said, for many Americans, or at least those considered to be white, 1900 was a time of hope for the future. So much about life in their country seemed to be happening so quickly. For example, in the past few decades, San Francisco had gone from a little outpost on the West Coast to becoming one of the nation's most cosmopolitan cities and the home of 350,000 people. Then there were all the new inventions being made at the time promising to change everyone's life. For example, X-rays had recently been discovered and were now being put into use by medical practices. Then there were things like the newfangled motion pictures that were becoming quite a fad. Now, granted, these motion pictures were a far cry from what we are used to today, as those at the time were mostly a kind of moving snapshot called views of either basic everyday activities or scenes of faraway and exotic places. These were just brief little glimpses, but more than enough to draw crowds and blow the minds of those seeing them. Automobiles around this time were also starting to grow in popularity, although at the time there were only 8,000 in the States, and there was also notably less than 10 miles of concrete roads in the entire country. Meanwhile, things that had once been luxuries like electric lighting and indoor plumbing were becoming increasingly available to the masses, although at this time there were reportedly more telephones and bathtubs in the nation. Meanwhile, this era also saw the beginnings of the music industry, as music for the first time really became a business between the selling of sheet music and the selling of records for early Victrolas. Music was now more accessible than ever, and people all across the country were able to listen to or recreate the same songs thanks to this new business model. To get an idea of what this music was like, among the styles popular at the time was ragtime, although it was seen as both outrageous and vulgar. Now, all these new inventions brought both the hope of the future and the fear of change to the populace. For as entertaining as moving pictures were, and for as much as electric lighting and indoor plumbing made people's lives better, there was also the loss of farm jobs as new machinery replaced farm laborers. Such changes led increasing numbers of people to move into the nation's cities hoping for new opportunities. These individuals, though, were often met with a crowded, noisy, confusing, and dirty environs that reeked of sewage. Such surroundings eventually led to a longing for nature among the people residing in these cities. In particular, there was a renewed fascination with the wilderness, which, as it turns out, was quickly vanishing thanks to unrestrained logging. So a hiking and mountaineering craze started, and groups like the Sierra Club were formed by people seeking to flee the dirty, crowded cities to reconnect with nature. This greater awareness of nature and its frailty also contributed to Congress for the first time passing legislation aimed at protecting the American buffalo, who were endangered of extinction as there were only 400 left on the entire continent. It seems then that to many Americans at the time, nature had become something that needed to be protected and not something to be afraid of. Nature, some even seemed to believe, was something they had mastered and could even control. This, however, would not be the case by the end of the year, as the people of the United States and of Galveston in particular would receive a stark reminder of the sheer power of nature and that their understanding and control over the world wasn't as complete as they might have liked to think. The storm that would eventually wreak such unfathomable destruction on Galveston, Texas on the 8th of September is believed to have first formed sometime around the 27th of August, an estimated 400 miles west of the Cape Verde Islands, which themselves lie roughly some 400 to 500 miles off the coast of